Hello, and welcome back to the I Wonder podcast. Today, on this episode, we are going to continue our college or fleeing the nest series with an episode looking at how the principles of explicit parenting apply when it feels like my job as parent is over, or at the very least has changed dramatically. In other words, now that my birdie has flown the nest, what's next? Let's get started. So just as a reminder, we have had an episode on how the explicit parenting principles apply to the college or adult application / transition process. We have talked about what to do down to the nitty-gritty stuff your students' junior and senior year of high school, whether they're going to college or not, sort of how to help them prepare for the future. And we have talked about what sort of general things on one of our mini episodes you might need if your kid is going to college. And for this episode, we're going to sort of conclude the series with, well, what now when in an overall theoretical way, what now that they're gone happens to me? And how does parenting change? And what do I do with these 4 principles now that there's no kid under my roof except for a few weeks a year? So we'll start there, and there will be more practical tips to come, I promise. So the 4 steps, if you remember, is know yourself, know your relationship, be curious, not judgmental, or listen more than you talk, and be consistent and persistent. And I have found, working with both my own children as a parent and with parents as a therapist, that these 4 tenets really apply throughout a kid's life. But what happens when that kid is an adult and doesn't live under your roof anymore, at least for the bulk of a year? So we're going to go back to those same 4 principles and apply them somewhat to our kids and somewhat to ourselves. So tuning in, knowing yourself. When child leaves, even if they're still living with us, but they're now an adult pursuing, some sort of career or some sort of, study that's closer to home, even if they're still living with us, things have changed pretty dramatically. And if they have gone off somewhere to college to study at a trade school or to, just move for a job, they've really changed dramatically. And that can throw us as their parent into a bit of a spiral of our own. Transitions are never easy. I can remember just doing the laundry in between seasons for my kids, weeping because I was putting away clothes that I knew they were never going to wear again. It's a similar feeling when they leave to go to school, because you are really sort of struck with this need to grieve the loss of that life for yourself. And I know that's a touchy word and a touchy subject, and people start to get nervous because we're talking about grief and loss, and that sounds like there should be death involved. But there's plenty of grief and plenty of loss out there for things that don't involve death. This transition is a loss. You are losing the life that you have built once new, and you're replacing it with something that could be even better or just as wonderful. But in those first few weeks and months, it almost feels like you've lost a part of yourself and you're not sure where you put it or when you're ever going to get it back. So tuning into yourself is good for a couple reasons. You should not only tune into how you're feeling, but also what might you need to get you through this time. My family always jokes that I need dogs because I've had 2 kids go to college, and the timing has worked that we've also had 2 new dogs in and around their freshman years of college. Not entirely true that I went in search of the dog because my kids were going to college, but also not entirely false. The sense of purpose that you get when you bring a puppy into the house, the need to be, focused on something, the routine and the schedule and the things that happen in order to raise a puppy was certainly beneficial when I was first going through the empty nesting phase. And my nest didn't empty at once. My oldest left and I still had 2 kids at home, and certainly focusing on them was helpful. But you have to be cautious there that you're not over focusing on the ones that are left in the house, because that's not fair to them either. So tuning into your own needs. What do you need? How are you going to feel better? What's going to fill the space that was left by the kid who has moved on and moved out? And are you willing to give yourself the space and the grace necessary to feel that grief and mourn that loss of what once was, even if things are great and wonderful and the kid's doing great and thriving, you might still feel some sadness. And are you willing to give yourself grace for that? it's a process. And we'll get to at the end when we talk about being consistent and persistent, how you sort of keep going through this process with each subsequent kid, or just as the school year goes on, as things change and you get more used to it and your body gets more used to the changes and you start to relax and be able to settle into the way that life looks now. I can tell you, I always like to share a story and tattle on myself a little bit, as if the puppy isn't enough. But I can remember when my oldest went. So she went, I've addressed this before on this podcast. She went to my same college. We attended the same university. She didn't live where I lived. She didn't study what I studied. The place looks completely different, as anybody around my age can probably tell you. Their colleges don't look anything like they did when they went there. So it's a very different place. And yet I had some familiarity with the area, and I would check find my phone. I don't have any of those Life 360s. I've never been one to sort of constantly follow where they are, but I found myself her freshman year, just wanting to know if she was back in her dorm and is she home for the night and is she okay? And I didn't want to text her and I didn't want to bug her and I didn't want to call her and I didn't want to act as if I didn't trust her to be taking care of herself, or I didn't want to put this fear in her that I was worried if she was out. So I didn't let her know, but I would just occasionally before I went to bed sort of just see where she was on campus. And it was okay sometimes, but there were times where I realized I wasn't going to sleep until I was able to check and see that she was in her dorm, which is not great. If you're trying to follow the schedule of a college student, you're not sleeping much. So I finally got to a place where I sort of forced myself to stop looking all the time and just, occasionally think oh, I haven't heard from her today. Let me check and see where she is on campus. And that will sort of alleviate some of what I'm feeling, because I tended to get at least a text or a meme sent to me or some message through Instagram or something like that. Pretty much every day from her, I would get some sort of proof of her existence. And so on the days where I didn't, I would sometimes just check to be I wonder where her phone is. And, it was always somewhere that had an explanation. But for me, I just found, okay, that's actually helping and it doesn't interfere with her at all. But I also had to tune in and realize it's actually not helping if I do it too much. And so that's kind of what I mean by tuning in. How are you feeling? What do you need? I was feeling anxious that I didn't know where she was. It's this very new sensation to go to bed at night and not have all your kids under the roof with you, and to not even really know where they are. And again, this can be true if your kid's away at school or not. If they are, 19 and you are no longer saying you have to be in by 11 o'clock at night or something, you might go to bed many nights and not know exactly where they are in the world. And so you have to figure out, well, what do I need to be able to get used to this? Because they're an adult and I can't keep them in my house and make them go to bed every night by 8 o'clock. So how do I continue to take care of myself while also respecting the relationship? And that's the second pillar, your relationships. You're still going to tune in to see how you want this to look. What are the expectations for this going forward? Again, you're not their parent in the way that you were 2 months ago. You are not aware of their day-to-day movement. You're not aware of their moment-to-moment movement. They're not going to be under your roof in many cases. And even if they're still living there, you have to shift a little bit of how you work with them as adults. So they are now maybe a contributing member of your household in a way they weren't before, but also you can't tell them what to do all the time either. So you tune into that relationship and figure out what do you need for it to be successful? What are the boundaries you want to set? How do you want to communicate? How do you want them to be able to communicate? What is your role in managing their emotions? This is a big one. We have spent all of their lives trying to protect them from danger. Maybe some of you have let go prior to this and you don't really know the ins and outs of their lives and you don't really try to sort of snowplow for them. But for many of us, we had a daily download of what was going on and how things were happening and all of those things. Well, they're older. And so even if you're still getting the daily downloads, very often that can mean you're carrying the weight of their growth and emotional baggage. And so how are you going to protect yourself from that while still allowing them space to process things? How are you going to manage the relationship? Are they looking for your advice? Are they just looking to vent? Is their venting too much for you? And if so, how do you communicate that to them? You can't solve every little problem. And if they come to you with every problem and you are feeling that real anxious pull toward trying to fix it, you need to check in both with yourself and with them and say, this isn't really working. I can't know every single step, but I want to be able to support you. Or you can say, if you're going to call me and tell me these things, I need to know if you're looking for me to tell you something, give you my suggestions, or if you just want to unload and hang up the phone and go figure it out yourself. There's going to be some honest conversations between you and your child, and there probably already have been, hopefully, if you've listened to these other episodes. There were plenty of honest conversations through the process of getting them here. And now that they're here and they're growing and they're being adults and they're learning how to be adults and they're learning how to be independent more than they ever have before, you have to check your own emotions and your own expectations for the relationship, and then set the boundaries and communicate those as well. Again, the summer that my oldest came home, actually not even the summer, the first break, which I can't even remember what it was. I think it was probably around Thanksgiving time that she came home, was almost like she came home and verbally dumped everything that had happened since we dropped her off in August onto us in the first couple of days. And I remember not really noticing as it was happening, but having a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I really feel dizzy, physically, I can't take in any more language. I can't process. And part of it was that she's just a, verbal processor, but part of it was me, because I was sort of jumping back into mom mode of ooh, good, she needs me. Let me try to analyze and fix and help and suggest and manipulate these situations so that she's feeling good and she doesn't have anything to worry about, and she's not experiencing any hardship or pain. And the problem with that was twofold. One, she didn't necessarily want me to do any of that stuff. She was growing up. She was learning. She was actually just kind of processing with me, because that's what she does. She talks things through, and that's how she gets through things. And two, I can't do that. I couldn't solve all her problems. I couldn't keep her free from pain. And all it was doing was making me feel miserable, because not only was I exhausted in trying, but I was feeling like a failure and like I wasn't doing my job as a mom. So I had to have a real hard talk with my own self, and then have a conversation with her about look, if you're going to bring me these things, you have to know that sometimes I'm going to have to say either I can't do this right now, or what do you need from me? And then I can be there in whatever way you need me to be there. But if I can't, I'm going to tell you up front I can't be there for you. Because what I was doing when she was home was dropping everything. I was so excited she was home. It was whatever she needed. And whenever she needed it, I was there, whether it was sleep or work or my other kids. She was getting my undivided and full attention. And that wasn't fair to anybody, myself included. So that relationship, I had to tune into my own expectations. I had to tune into what was coming up for me. And between the two of us, we worked out okay, how's this going to go forward in a way that respects us both? And so that goes into sort of the last two tenets, which is, the be curious, not judgmental, or listen more than you talk, is what I like to say. And then the final one is be consistent and persistent. And the curious and not judgmental typically has to do with your child. Usually when I tell parents, be consistent, be curious, ask questions, try not to assume or judge or lecture as if you know them better than they know themselves. In this case, that curiosity and judgment free needs to be reserved for you. You need to be curious about, well, what's next for me? How do I feel in this situation? What is bringing me joy? What is filling the space? What am I struggling with? What do I need to feel better? In that instance with my daughter, I noticed first that I just wasn't feeling well. And it was, I was overwhelmed and anxious because I hadn't been keeping up with my work and I wasn't sleeping really great. And I was carrying this mental load for her that she never asked me to carry. I just assumed, oh, she's coming to me with these things. I need to figure out a way to help her through them. And that wasn't really true. She didn't need that all the time. Sometimes that's exactly what she wants, but sometimes she just wants to tell me the story and move on with her life. And I was carrying it around. And so it took first me noticing this was May and we had the whole summer to get through. And I don't know if I can handle that. And so, or it was November. And once it happened at home, she was calling me on the phone and saying, hey, this happened today. This happened today. This is happening today. This is happening today. And sometimes the problems were ones that you would want to call your mom and sort of work out with your mom. But sometimes they were just, she was, for lack of a better word, bitching about what was going on. And I was taking it on as here I come with my superhero mom cape that I need to fix everything for her. And that's not sustainable. But I also had to give myself some grace there to not judge myself in that moment and say, here you go again. You're doing it again. So I had to tune in and figure out why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And then I had to be curious about, well, what's underneath that? What do I feel the need to do? And then I went back to the relationship piece of what I want her to be able to talk to me, but I also need to be able to preserve my own self, everything. And so how do I do that? Let me get curious about how I do that rather than just going down the rabbit hole of I'm the worst mom. I can't handle anything. I try to overstep and blah, 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 whatever other judgments we throw on ourselves. So the consistent and persistent part is for us and them. We need to consistently be tuning in and checking our relationship status and being curious about what we need and how we need to do it, and giving ourselves the grace to learn and grow and do all of those things. And we need to be persistent in the pursuit of that. This is, yes, a huge change, a huge transition, for sure filled with loss, but also an opening of a door that hasn't been open likely for you in 18 years. Even if you have other kids at home, there's a shift when one or more go to college in that you're able to have different relationships with the ones at home too. You've learned a little, you've seen a little, you have a little bit more space in your day. And even if you're not going to jump into a new career or a new anything right away because you still have others at home, it is the opening of that door opens just a little crack to let some light in to part of you that maybe has been asleep for a long time. What brings me joy? What would I do if I had an extra couple hours a day? What will happen if this part of my brain that's constantly been focused on sports schedules or dance recitals or National Honor Society or college applications or plumbing, school criteria, what if that part of my brain is suddenly free and I don't have to do it anymore? Being persistent in the pursuit of that, being curious in that, noticing as you go about your day, as you go about your weeks and months that they're gone, noticing what's lighting me up, what isn't lighting me up anymore, what don't I feel like doing anymore, and what do I feel like doing that I maybe haven't been able to do in a while. My husband and I got back to, watching shows together that weren't interrupted 14 times. But, that didn't happen until the second one went to college because the second one is a notorious show interrupter. But we got back to each other. We got back to each other. We got back to ourselves. We got back to things like golf for him and the gym for me, things that just weren't consistent in our lives prior because there just wasn't time. All of our time was devoted to kids and family, and we're not complaining about any of it. But what I am sharing is that this transition, although there was some loss and some sense of like confusion and a little bit of like, I was a little spacey for a while. I was a little misdirected for a while because I wasn't really sure what to do with this new time and new space. But once I settled in a little and realized like I've done what I'm supposed to do to get here, they are launched and they're doing okay. And I know how much I need to still pay attention to them and be there for them and show up for them. But I have all of this opening. Once I got comfortable with that idea, it became kind of exciting to think about, well, what's next? What can I do to fill those spaces? And it's easy in those moments to turn toward the judgmental or turn toward the grief and judge ourselves for that too. Trust me, not only did I get a new puppy, but I spent a good portion of the fall real sad when she first went away. I would text friends who were in the same boat and we would share our sadness with each other. I would try to fill the time with other things, but mostly I just wanted to like read a book or sleep or not think about it, or track her on my phone or text her or see what she was doing or talk to my husband about what I thought she was doing or any number of things. I went to a lot more college football games than I have in 20 years. I planned a lot more road trips than I ever have before. I also planned a lot more with the remaining kids because I was suddenly almost desperate to spend as much time with them as I could because I had this realization of how quickly it all goes. That's not a bad thing. The idea that I poured into them a little bit more because I could actually made it a little bit easier when it was time to let go a second time. And I'm about to let go a third time, and I'll tell you how that ends up. But I know that if I hadn't been persistent in pursuing my own joy, then I could have just ended up a lady with too many dogs and too much time on her hands. So if you can tune into yourself, understand how you're feeling, identify how you're feeling, and then try to understand how you're feeling. When my first one went away, I had this almost visceral response that surprised me a little bit. And it turns out, after some curiosity and some digging, I realized I'm the youngest of 6 kids by a shot. So like when I was older elementary school into adolescence, my siblings were either gone or going from the house. So let's say I was 10 and the one closest to me would have been like a sophomore or junior in college. So all of my siblings, I spent most of my childhood watching my siblings leave the home, grow up, move out, go to college, get married, find roommates, get their own houses, that kind of thing. I watched all these adults, essentially. My siblings were basically adults. And so when my oldest went away, I had this weird reaction, not like a maternal reaction, almost like I was a little kid who was being abandoned. And I realized, oh, that's how it felt. When I was a little kid, it really felt like everyone's leaving. And I'm just here alone with my mom in this sad place because, she was a widow and it was empty and she was probably going through all of these same empty nest emotions. But there I was, alone, really is what it felt like. And so I had a little bit of triggering response when my oldest went. And then when my second one went and my youngest was the only one left at home, I had this overwhelming need to make sure he didn't feel alone. I had to temper that with, don't overdo it. This poor kid, we kind of joked the whole summer prior with him about how he was going to be so sick of us and he was going to wish that we, weren't his parents anymore because we would be, left with only him in the house. And so we would be wildly overbearing. We really tried not to be. We tried to strike a nice balance between giving him his space and freedom to grow up just like the other ones had, but also not taking for granted any moment that we were able to get with him. So if he was going to be home for dinner, I made dinner. If he was going to, if he didn't go out on a weekend night because something else was going on, we made sure we were home on a weekend night. If we went out to dinner, my husband and I, we took him with us because we were like, we didn't want him to feel alone. We didn't want him to feel like he was the only, the last man standing, if you will. And part of that was how I feel today. But part of that came from that little girl part of me that was like, oh, it was the worst when I was the last one left. So tuning in, knowing myself, helping to understand where I am in the world now that this job that I've had for so many years is changing. It's not going away. I'm always going to be their mom, but the role is very different now than it was before. And so tuning into how I feel and what I need to feel differently, but also staying curious and giving myself the grace to sort of examine and watch to see, well, what is it that lights me up? What is it that is no longer serving me? And how can I build my life to include more of the first and less of the second? And then knowing my relationship is not only knowing my relationship with myself, but understanding what my relationship is with this person going forward. How do I want it to look? What boundaries do I need to set? What things do I need to put in place in order for us to have the kind of relationship and have it be sustainable? I want to be there for my kids, but not to the detriment of my own mental health. And then staying curious, giving yourself that grace and giving them grace to stumble and fall and do it wrong and talk too much or not talk enough or forget to call you or lose things or whatever else it is. Giving yourself a wide berth as they turn into grownups and you try to support them along the way. And just be consistent with all of it. Be consistent with your boundaries. Be persistent in allowing yourself and them the space you both need to grow. You've got this, parents. I'm sure of it. Thanks for listening. And until the next time, stay curious. Remember, if you heard anything you liked today, please like and subscribe and share this with your friends. The more people that listen, the better off this next season of your life will be.